motivating launch panel. We're now going to move on as we kind of get a little bit deeper into some of the issues to our next industry keynote panel, which is Reset the Ambition. So I'd like to invite my next two panelists to the stage, Andrew Lever, who is Director of Energy Transition for the Carbon Trust, and Kristin Tilley, who's Ambassador for Climate Change from Australia, for Australia. Thank you, guys. Round of applause, please. It makes us feel much more included. Hello, nice to see you. Thank you so much. Well, Kristin in particular, have you joined us directly from Australia? Have you been here for a few days?
You very rarely come all the way just for one event. I did, as important as this event is, I did add on a couple of extra trips. I was in Malta and then Geneva, now finishing with London Climate Week before I go home.
Amazing, thank you. And Andrew, you joined us from Scotland, so not quite as, epic, but thank you for being here.
No problem. Nice to be here, everyone. Yeah, good morning.
Okay, so this is a lot of big subjects we want to get through. So we're talking about resetting the ambition. We kind of want to know how do we do a reset domestically, globally, where we're at, what's missing, what's here, and what to look forward to. So not much to do in about 10, 15 minutes. Andrew, let's start with you. It might be a while since people have checked in with the Carbon Trust, but you recently welcomed a new chief exec, Chris Stark, who many of us will know, who was previously led the Committee on Climate Change. So it's a good chance to check in. What are the changes to the mission focus since some of us last engaged?
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, I mean the mission itself hasn't necessarily changed in terms of the words, and that's to accelerate the move to a decarbonised future. So we're now over 400 experts based both here in the UK and globally, and still working in between, quite unique really, between business and government, and that gives us a bit of a unique position in terms of getting close to decisions and supporting people in their transition to net zero. And that word transition is something which we need to think about in terms of time, and for example with business, with plans and with changing policy, that pathway is really important because things will change over time and you need to be kind of laser focused and move and change with that pathway as it evolves. And we do that through footprinting and providing target setting, for example. I think the other thing that is in the mission statement, of course, is acceleration. And we've had some great successes with accelerating technology in the UK here, particularly in offshore wind. And that's now in its 15th year, one of our initiatives to the Offshore Wind Accelerator. And that's resulted in a kind of 15% reduction in levelized cost of energy. So that's a real success story. And that point around acceleration and collaboration and innovation is going to be increasingly important as we move forward. Internationally, we're seeing some really interesting things. China, for example, almost not quite at tipping point in terms of peak emissions, but a lot of investment in manufacturing of solar PV, as you know, are now moving into wind. Now, interestingly, last year, China installed more solar PV than the US has ever done. They're installing a quarter of the world's heat pumps, and they're the largest manufacturer of electric vehicles. Now, they're not doing that from a philanthropic perspective, or a climate perspective. They're doing that from an economic perspective because they can see that this is where the global economy is now moving. And so I think that's something that we just all need to be quite aware of, is that this, if we need to get on board with this and engage with it in terms of this is an economic opportunity now in terms of moving that transition through to net zero.
Do you think that's been missing then? Because, you talked about some of the successes, but we've also had some spectacular misfires. So is it that we haven't been framing it quite in the right way, or we haven't had the evidence?
I think we're, in terms of resetting the ambition, I think we have come a good way in the UK with regards to the power sector and promoting renewables through the various mechanisms that are there. We now need to kind of really kickstart and move that forward and change gears almost. And I think that then comes back to really being very slick around the amount of infrastructure that needs to be put in place. And some of, we've got some examples of where that is working elsewhere. But yeah, there's a tremendous amount of investment that's now required in the sector to move us forward into the next kind of couple of decades. And that's an opportunity. And I think that's where the positiveness of this comes from.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Thank you. Kristin, so we get the opportunity to check in on Australia, which is a particularly, incredibly interesting test case. So Australia publicly announced a wide range of climate and energy transition policies over the past few years. How are you progressing on these? And what do you see as the main challenges in meeting your targets?
Thanks very much, Lucy, and thanks very much for the invitation to be part of this panel. Look, really, for those who haven't had an in-depth interest in Australian climate and climate politics over decades, what has happened in the last couple of years is quite interesting. We had our current government win an election largely on its climate policies, and not only did our government sort of come in with a strong climate mandate, independent members of parliament were elected in very large numbers with strong climate policies as well. So not only did the government change, the parliament and the makeup of the parliament changed quite a lot in favour of strong action on climate. What the government really did from very early on in its now 2-year-long term of government is start very much with the energy sector, so increased our 2030 target, legislated net zero by 2050 to give that really important policy certainty to industry and the community that this is the direction we're heading in. Invested government funding in particular in upgrading our grid to bring in the large amount of renewables, principally being funded by the private sector that is wanting to do more, but to have the grid ready to bring those renewables on. Set a renewable energy target of 82% renewables by 2030. That's from 32% in 2022 when the government came in, 82% by 2030. That is one of the challenges I'll come back to. And has then sort of quite methodically gone through electricity sector, industrial sector with legislation and regulation to bring down emissions from our largest industrial emitters 5% year on year, transport sector, and is now moving into some of the harder and more challenging spaces, including agriculture. What I will say in terms of the challenges, like many countries, the speed in which our ambition requires us to build out from a largely fossil fuel-based, coal-based energy system to an almost entirely renewables one in a very short period of time is challenging. We're not yet in those 2 years delivering at the pace we need to, but it's still a significant ramp up from where we've been. And many of the things you hear others talk about, such as the planning policies and regulations in place, and to some extent, some community concern about the speed of the build-out of wind farms, solar and transmission lines. They're the challenges.
Okay, that's a good spread of challenges too. I wonder, Andrew, we might leap ahead to a coal question here, because maybe you could help Kristin. You're a bit of an expert on the coal transition. So, because I'm kind of struck by the Carbon Trust work, particularly around coal, because you have a lot of experience there, obviously, from the UK's transition, and you sort of export that experience, don't you? Because you have been working with other countries.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and the UK's last coal-fired power station closed just this year. Yeah, so that's a bit of a milestone, and certainly one that's seen quite a transformation over the last couple of decades. So yeah, we've been doing a lot of work in coal asset transition, coal retirement. As many of you will know, it's the largest single source of carbon emissions in the world. Quite often, those assets, a lot of them in Southeast Asia and China, and a lot of those coal assets are tied up in long-term contracts and government-owned. A lot of them are very linked into the economy and with jobs and livelihoods associated with them as well. So we've been working on a number of initiatives looking at innovative ways to finance these coal assets off the system. One such mechanism is with the Asian Development Bank. It's called the Energy Transition Mechanism. And we worked with them in Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, in Pakistan and Kazakhstan to look at the coal fleet within that particular country and region, and look at where and which assets that we could focus in on to refinance, invest in them. The basic concept is that you use that financing to effectively buy up the assets and reduce its lifetime So you're reducing the lifetime carbon from that asset. The proceeds from that sale get recycled back into renewables. So there's this kind of recycling ability, and it's there to try and listen, I guess, to those countries and the setups of those energy systems and policies. But I think it's as Kristin said, it's not just about the financing of coal. There has to be a broader policy and pathway to transitioning from that fossil-based system into the renewables-based system. And that's critically important. And there's still quite a bit of work to do there. But I think that's one example of where in the UK we've come through this transition. We've made some mistakes, a few mistakes. We have one of the most competitive markets in the world. We have one of the most kind of innovative sectors in energy in the world. So we can have that opportunity to support other countries and regions, help them through that transition as well.
Can I add one thing in to add to Andrew's remarks? Australia is doing a fair amount of work with Southeast Asian countries to support their energy transition as well. So very much many of the comments Andrew made we're observing ourselves. One additional point which makes the transition more difficult, I think, in many Southeast Asian countries compared to, say, Australia and I think a number of developed countries who are exiting coal, is many of our coal-fired power generators are now 40 and 50 years old and were reaching end of life anyway. That does bring challenges because, as I said before, if the pace of renewables filling the gap, as our energy demand grows, as it does in all countries, at the right time for those announced coal closures to happen, then that creates reliability problems. In Southeast Asia, there's a different challenge in that many of their coal-fired generators are only about 7, 8, 9, 12 years old and still have, many decades of viable and economically productive life in front of them. So the ability to provide a financial incentive to change course is very different than, well, these coal-fired plants are retiring, how do we make sure we're investing in renewables to fill the gap? It's actually you've got to provide a stronger value proposition in Southeast Asian countries to shift off a viable energy source.
Just to pick up on a little point that you mentioned there, do you think we should be doing more about powering down and using less energy rather than just saying that, energy demands are just going to increase and increase and increase? Is there anything we can do there?
I'd love to hear Andrew's remarks. My own personal view is there's a lot governments can do to incentivise and motivate much stronger energy efficiency policies and practices. I don't think, though, any government would suggest to a consumer, to a voter, you need to stop using energy in a way that benefits your lifestyle in terms of,
isn't that the problem?
It's part of a problem, depending on the energy source, and with some of the challenges I said, yes, we're not building out the renewables as fast as we need to, so energy efficiency is a key role. I just don't think many governments in democracies will tell consumers, stop buying X equipment or X car or what have you because we don't want you drawing down as much energy. I think the emphasis needs to be on sensible policies around energy efficiency, but not as a reduce energy entirely.
Andrew, energy efficiency, we could do a bit more, no? Somebody could market that.
Yeah, we absolutely could, and it should be always the first thing to do first, of course. And this is where it gets contextually kind of important because, and locational important. In the UK, the energy efficiency challenge is more on heat, arguably, than it is on the power side through the building stock that we do have and the necessities to do that first before you then think about fuel switching away from fossils and gas. But it's also worth mentioning that even in the UK, our power demand in 2050 is going to be between 2 and 3 times bigger than it is today. And that's because we're seeing this switch from to electrification from transport, from heat. So, and that's probably going to be similar across many countries around the world as well. So actually our power demand globally is going to increase, and I think we should accept that. Renewables has, of course, that kind of central role to play in that. It does raise the question around infrastructure and grid, of course, which is another big building block that needs to be a key part of that.
So grid reform and all of that piece.
It's everything. I mean, we need more of it. We need to operate it more efficiently, and There's various ways, again, coming back to the UK, there's been a tremendous amount of innovation put into the network sector over the last decade or so, which has mean, energy flexibility and using electric vehicles and heat pumps as assets on the system really helped to bring down the costs. I mean, we did a report a few years ago now, but we estimated that between 10 and 17 billion pounds per year could be saved if we invested in energy flexibility as part of that infrastructure build out to 2050. So that's, it's both, we need more of it, but we also need to be very smart. Because if we get it right and we manage it better, one, we don't need to build as much infrastructure, and two, ironically, we don't need to build as much renewables because we're using more of what we have much more efficiently and effectively.
By the way, the Carbon Trust has the best reports. Andrew, you've written many of them. If it's a treasure trove, I think the next administration just needs to go through all the reports and all the answers are there. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about ambition and acceleration. So, Kristin, I'd love to ask you a bit more about climate finance, which you've mentioned a couple of times. Significantly larger amounts of climate finance than previously committed globally are going to be needed to address climate change properly. We know that. Will Australia increase its contribution to the next round of global commitments? And what are some of the challenges to achieving effective climate finance?
So Australia is already increasing its climate finance. From a government perspective, climate finance has traditionally been channeled through overseas development assistance to developing countries. And we've just introduced in Australia, and it starts on 1 July actually, a new policy that from 1 July, half of all new ODA investments, official development assistance investments, need to have a climate outcome. And when we look at sort of what the proportion is over the last couple of years, it's only been around a quarter of our ODA has gone towards climate outcomes. So for 1 July this year, it's already doubling, rising to 80% by 28-29. So if you follow that through logically, our climate finance is increasing at quite a steep rate throughout this decade. In terms of the climate negotiations, and you referred to those, what will Australia commit to a stronger contribution internationally through those negotiations? I don't want to prejudge the outcome of those negotiations. A very strong view we have is that a wider set of countries needs to be providing climate finance. Don't want to bore you all with the intricacies of climate negotiations, but developed countries in the UN climate negotiations are the 30 or so countries that were OECD members in 1992. So quite often when countries say, or people say, developed countries need to increase their climate finance, agree, and Australia is, but we absolutely need to widen the base of those countries that are also contributing, that have the means to, that might not have back in 1992, but do now. One other quick comment, innovation in how governments use their climate finance, absolutely essential. So we are now, on a small scale, but it's growing, using some of our official development assistance to fund and leverage private sector funding into developing countries. And it's a very difficult thing for a bureaucrat to provide advice to government to buy down risk in a project so that the private sector is more willing to come in because government's taken more of the risk. And so, having some of my colleagues who work on this talk about, we think we should take a first loss position on this project, and thinking, okay, now we have to convince the minister that they should use, millions of Australian dollars to take a risky position in an investment that may or may not, we're not looking for a return, but we need to buy down that risk so private sector who is looking for a return is more willing to invest in the project as well. And so that's some of the innovation that we're starting to look at that I think needs to underpin the way governments engage to drive much greater sums of climate finance going forward.
What is your background? Is it in finance?
No, it's not.
Oh.
And so I have had lots of 101s on first loss and guarantees and larger senior debt and terms like that, so I can have some of those conversations.
You did very well. That's why I wondered. Yeah. And whilst I have you, Australia is very keen, I hear, to host COP. What number will it? 31, and that will be 2026. Yes. Why? What would be the advantage for Australia getting in there?
Well, one of the things that, in addition to climate ambition, our government brought when they came into power 2 years ago was a very strong focus on our relationships in the Pacific with our Pacific nation counterparts. We're part of the Pacific, they're some of our closest neighbours, and they are a very strong and legitimately moral voice on climate change, and we get that. So one of our positions generally has been to listen, to respect, and to, where we can, support and amplify those strong Pacific voices on climate change. And so we think, what better way to bring the world's attention to the need for much stronger global action than to have a Pacific COP. So Australia's bid, we would physically host in Australia, should we be successful in winning that bid, physically host in Australia, but do it in genuine partnership with our Pacific Island colleagues.
Okay, thank you. Andrew, what will the Carbon Trust be asking the next administration for policy-wise? And similarly, ask for the finance community, what needs to happen to accelerate action?
Yeah, I mean, I think the two are kind of linked, if I can join the two questions together. I mean, I think much has been said around having an industrial strategy in the UK. I think that's missing. As I said, with the China example at the start of our discussion, this is now much more of an economic opportunity than it is, as well as being a kind of climate goal as well. So there is a big opportunity now to invest in the UK in infrastructure, in technology to do that. Many of the reports I've seen on from the National Engineering Policy Forum have reinforced that. So we are at this juncture now where we do need to take investment forward. An example from Europe, TenneT, who are the Dutch transmission system operator, have just planned for 14 2-gigawatt HVDC connectors in the North Sea, which will help connect up and realise and enable more offshore renewables to be built out into the North Sea to help meet Europe's targets for renewables.
Is that the Viking line?
It's
that's what's been dubbed the Viking line.
The Viking line, yeah. It's going to enable 28 gigawatts of renewables, offshore renewables by 2031, I think, is their target. But it's just a very clear ask of the supply chain coming around a common standard to say, okay, here's our target. This is what we need. We're going to partner up with supply chain and collaborate to deliver that. And that just removes the uncertainty. It just gives a very clear plan forward. It's a no-regret situation and solution. So things like that within the UK, I think, given the opportunity, the challenge that we have in terms of infrastructure build-out, would be very, very welcome from an incoming or new government. So I think that's one thing I'd say. I think the other thing which I was reading the Windsor report, which is on the Transmission Commission. I think it was last year, year before. There was a recommendation number 12, which was down in the depths of it, but it said something like, there's a real opportunity to have a much more open dialogue with consumers and with society around what this change actually looks like and what this change needs to look like. And we haven't really had that dialogue coming from government to say, look, this is what's going to be required, and just opening that up. So I think, that's an opportunity and challenge for all of us, but I think that is something, rather than viewing net zero as a burden, it should be more about an opportunity, and to help people visualize that so that when they do see planning applications coming through on infrastructure and on grid and whatever, then at least they have some context around that. That's not going to be an overnight thing, of course, but I think we need to change that narrative generally across the country.
Thank God for Mr. Lever reading point 12 and remembering point 12 of that report. Thank you. Okay, we're going to do a really quick wrap-up question now. That has been amazing. I've got so much information from this. Radical collaboration is a real theme of Reset Connect, and indeed probably all our work, and definitely London Climate Action Week. What collaborations, radical or otherwise, might you want to see happening, Kristin?
Well, I'm a bureaucrat, so I don't know I am allowed to be overly radical.
Too radical.
So this isn't radical, but it's deeply important, certainly from Australia's perspective. Much more engagement, empowerment and decision-making ability to First Nations communities in the clean energy transition. In Australia's own case, much of the regional build-out of large-scale renewables, we have so much land, but that a lot of this is in traditionally owned communities. And we do have a long history in Australia of mining communities engaging for the right reasons with First Nations communities, but not in a way, in a tick-the-box way, to be honest. The way we need to do it with the clean energy build-out, certainly in Australia's case, is to make sure the starting point is not, somebody said this to me recently, not, okay, we'll come and we'll ask you questions and that's consultation and we'll see what your interests are, but actually start with, go out and consult and say, what are the questions you think we should be asking you about this project? So actually start from a basis of a very blank page. What are your interests? How do we build them in? And how do we make sure you derive direct community benefit and ownership where possible in this important change?
Thank you. Cool, go radical.
I'm going to add another topic into the discussion right at the end, but that is that one of the biggest challenges here in the UK is decarbonisation of heat and how we do that. Now that requires a lot of collaboration, it requires a lot of local thinking. It's linked into strategic spatial energy planning because you can look at this upon a case area by area. You mentioned regions. But no one's cracked this yet, and the challenge, of course, is because there's 30-odd million homes in the UK with individual heating systems. But we do need to. That'll be the next frontier in terms of decarbonisation. So radical collaboration to look for the solutions and accelerate those solutions around that would be very welcome.
Very good. Thank you for ending us on that note. Thank you both. I really enjoyed that. I hope you did too. Can we have a round of applause for Kristin and for Andrew? You are free to go. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so we've got a little break here now. Panel starting again about 10:10. So we've got 8 minutes before the panel starts. City Stage, Building Tomorrow's City, a sustainable haven for nature and humanity. Finance Stage, transition to a new financial world order, and the Net Zero Business Stage, major brand transformation. They're all coming up next. I'll be back here at 1 o'clock when I'll be talking to Dr. Thomas Becker from BMW Group, and I'm going to go and check out some of the stands, so maybe see you there as well. Thank you.